Hey guys, in today's video I want to show you how to create an API in a Node environment using Express and MongoDB. We're going to be using Mongoose to interact with our Mongo database, and I'm going to be showing you guys how to do things like error handling, what middleware is and how to create multiple middleware, and then at the end I'm going to show you guys how to group your endpoints so that you can maintain a large code base that has many endpoints. Okay, so to get started, let's first initialize our npm project. So let's do npm init, and this is just in my terminal. It's going to ask us a bunch of questions. I'm just going to skip through all of them. And then let's first install all our dependencies. So do npm I. If you're following along, just write down the dependencies, and then as I use them, I'll explain what each one does. So the first one we want is Express. Then we want body parser. And then we want nodemon, and then mongoose. Okay, now that all of the dependencies have been installed, let's create a index.js file. So this is going to be our entry point, so index.js. And before we go any further, let's just set up our development server. So let's go to our package.json and then create a new script, and I'm going to call it dev. And what it's going to run is nodemon index.js. So nodemon is one of the dependencies that we installed, and what nodemon does is that it essentially listens for file changes in our directory, and then it will restart our server. So before, what we'd have to do is we have to do something like node index.js. We'd have to run it. Right now, index is just empty. And then if we made a change, we'd have to stop the server and then come down here and run it again. So that can become quite annoying. So instead with nodemon, essentially what it does is that anytime we make a change, it will restart the server for us. So we'll run node index.js again. So let's do npm run dev. And you can see here, it will start it up. If I do something like console log hello world, if I save that, you can see restarting due to changes, starting node index.js, and then we get hello world here, and then it closes out. So you can see that's working nicely. I'm just going to minimize the terminal, and let's first get started by getting Express. So we say const express is equal to require express. So we have to actually create a new instance of Express by calling it. So we can call it whatever we want, so app, and then we say express, and then we have to actually call the function. Alternatively, what you could just do is move this to the end here, because this is essentially this, and then we can just rename Express to app, or whatever you want to call it. So now app lets us do things like attach endpoints to it. So a good way to show this would be with a simple get request. So we can do app.get. So the request method is a get method. There's also like things like post, patch, delete, put. So there's all your standard HTTP methods. And just for now, let's just do a get request. So a very simple one. The first parameter it expects is the path. So what URL do we have to go to? And this does not include the domain. So we're going to be running this on localhost. Let's say we run it on port 5000. So path is this part here. So I'm just going to have this be the base path. Okay, so we specified the path. Now the next parameter is it expects multiple, but just for now, I'm only going to put one. And then we're going to talk about middleware a bit later on as to how that works. But just for now, think of it like this. When we send a get request to this path, this function here is going to run. So let's put a function here. So a get request to this path will trigger this function to run. And it's not entirely true because there's middleware involved as well, but I'll get into that in just a moment. So this function gives us a couple of parameters. So first we get the request. There's the request object containing things like your request body. You get the response object, which has methods on it that allow you to actually send back your response. So if you want to send back, let's say a 200, or your status code is 200 or 500, something like that, or even if you want to add in some JSON. And then the final parameter we get is next. This is actually just a function, and this is to do with middleware and going to the next function in the middleware stack. Once again, I'll go further into middleware in a little bit, but just for now, ignore this. Okay, so let's look into the response object. So I'm just calling it res here. And what we can do is we can say response dot, and then this gives us a bunch of methods. One of these methods is the status. So we can say what status we want to return. So just for now, I'm going to put 201. So 201 stands for created. And then I'm going to chain onto this .json. And this expects the JSON body. Now, normally JSON is actually a string, but we can put a JavaScript object because Express will actually stringify this object for us. So what I'm going to do is just say test, this is working. And that's it. So now before we test this, we have to actually listen on a certain port for any requests made against this port. So I'm going to do app.listen, and then we specify what port we're going to be listening on. So I'm just going to choose 500, 5000. And the second parameter is just a callback, which will run as soon as it starts listening. I'm just going to console log started listening on port 5000. Okay, so if we save this and open up our terminal, you can see we have started listening on port 5000. So this is listening, and you can see our project hasn't terminated. So you can see it's still running and it's still waiting for a request to be made. So now let's just open up Postman and let's make a GET request to localhost 5000. So you can see it's a GET request and we're getting a status of 201, which is what we set. And you can see the JSON body here is test, this is working. So everything's working fine. Now, one thing to point out is you will run into an error if you try to do this again. So here's what I mean. So let's say change this to 400 and this is after. If I save this and I run it again, you can see we're still getting the initial one, but if we look here, it actually throws an error. As you can see here, you have to be careful not to do this multiple times. Easy way to get around that is just to return. That way this code is never reached. Okay, so this is the simple structure of a request handler. Now let's get into middleware. Middleware are functions that we can run at certain times when the request is made. So an example would be we can run a middleware before this request actually reaches this function, and we could also run one after this request, after we send back the response. So it might sound a bit confusing, so I'll just show you guys an example. What we do is we say app.use, and the way that we're actually doing it right now is we're attaching this to app. So this is going to be global for every endpoint that you have within your project. So just keep that in mind right now. You can scope it to certain groups of endpoints or just individual endpoint, and I'll show you guys how to do that in just a moment. So use expects a function, and it's actually the same function signature as this. So we get the request, the response, and the next. So in this case, all I'm going to do is console log before. Okay, so we've console log before, and I'm also just going to throw in the request.url. So this is actually the path that it's going to go to. And then what we have to now do is we have to say next. So we have to call it as a function. So what this is doing is it's saying when this runs, it will move on to the next function in the stack. So it's saying this middleware is done, move on to the next one. We could have something like a before 2, in which case this next would mean it goes onto this function. So this one would run, and this one would trigger next, which would eventually we'd go to our actual endpoint, which might contain something like our business logic. So let's just only test this with one for now. So if I save this and I run it, and actually let's also add in a console log here saying during, just so we see the order of this. So now if I send the request out, you can see this, it's completely unchanged. We're still getting a 201, and the request body is the same. The response body is the same. And if we look here, we can see before, and then we can see during. So this is triggered first, and then it gets onto this endpoint, and then this is triggered, and then we send back the response. Just a quick note here. If we actually remove this status and we save it, so now we're only returning JSON, this will just default to a 200. So if I send this, you can see it defaults to 200. So if you're sending a 200, you can just leave that out and just only specify the JSON. Now, just to show you guys that this actually, that you can do this with multiple, if I do before 2, and I just save that, I send the new request, you can see we get before 2, and then during. Now remember, you have to call next, otherwise it doesn't go on to the next middleware in the stack. Okay, so now as one more example, I'm actually just going to put a middleware after the endpoint. So we have this one running before it, this one is actually the business logic, and then we have this one here, which I'm going to call after. And to actually get to this one, we do have to call next. So we have to say next here as well in the actual endpoint function. So if I save that and I run it, we get before, during, and after. So this is just to show you guys that you can have multiple middleware, and it can be before you actually reach the endpoint, and after the endpoint it sends back the response. Alternatively, one more thing that you can do is you can actually add a message here and pass it to the next function. So here's what I mean by that. If I add in a new parameter here, and I call it error, so the function signature now is a little bit different. We have error, request, response, and next, where error is going to be whatever you put in here. So if I say hello world, and then if I just change this to be error, we save that and run it, you can see we get before. So this runs, goes to next, this runs, and then we pass to the next one, this string hello world. And then you can see in after we actually get that string. So this is only if you're actually passing something here. If this was empty, this actually wouldn't run. So if I have this be empty, send this, you can see it does, it just does before and during. This one never gets run. So this is called a error handling middleware. I'll get into error handling in a bit more depth in just a bit, but for now, I hope you guys understand the basic gist of middleware. Actually, one more thing I just want to show you guys is so far these two middleware have been global. If you want middleware specific to one endpoint, so like only on this endpoint, I want to do this, then what we can do is let's just convert this to a function. Let's say log middleware. Then what we can do is we can actually add as many middleware as we want to a endpoint. So here I'm just going to say log middleware. And now with this endpoint, this log middleware will run and then it will get to this one. So if we just test that out and we send the request, you can see that we get before and during. And if I create another endpoint, let's just call this test. And I don't have this log middleware. Let's just say I call this test2. So I make a request to /test. We get test2, so it's going to the correct endpoint. You can see it just says during. It doesn't say before. So this middleware here is specific to this endpoint. We can, of course, just add it in here. So if we wanted this to also be used for this endpoint, we can use it here. And if we want it to be global, then we do it similar to this. And I hope it's also clear that the order that you put these are important. So because I've put this below this one, then it will always get called after it. And this one specifically will only get called if we pass in some sort of information into next. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of all the middleware that we have so far. And I actually next want to look into getting the request body. So let's just delete all of this. And let's just keep this one here. Okay, so if I wanted to get the request body, so let me convert this to a post request. And let's just console log the request.body. And let's see what happens if I throw in some sort of data. So if I go back to the base, the root URL, I go and add in a JSON body and I say name John Doe and I send this. Let's check the console and you can see here it's actually undefined. The reason for this is that we actually need a middleware that is going to parse the request body for us and then put it into this request.body object. And that's why we install the dependency body parser. Let's grab that dependency. So it's body parser, require body parser. So this is actually middleware, and the way that you use middleware, so not your own middleware, but something from a third-party package, is you would do app.use, so the same as creating your own one, but instead of putting in a function yourself here, you would use the function that is provided to you by package. So I'm going to use body parser.json, and this will pass JSON requests for us. And then one more I'm going to add is app.use body parser.url encoded, and make sure to call both of these. Specifically with URL encoded, so this is for parsing things like your query strings, and there's also rich query strings, which include things like arrays and objects within your query. One thing we have to add to this is an options object, and specifically option extended. So this is either true or false. I'm going to set this to false. In case you guys are wondering what this is, extended is used to pick which package you're going to be using to actually parse the URL. So if you set this to false, it will use a package called query strings. And if you set this to true, it will use a package called QS. You can look into those packages and see which one you need. I'm going to be using query string, so I'm just going to set this to false. Okay, so we've added this in, so let's save this and now make the request again. And now if we look here, we actually have name John Doe. So the body is actually now contains the JSON body. And then of course we could do something like put this here request.body if we wanted to see it here. Okay, so now that we've actually passed the request body, next thing we're going to look into is Mongo. So to connect to Mongo, so I'm just going to minimize my terminal. So to connect to Mongo, we first have to get Mongoose. So let's say Mongoose is equal to require Mongoose. And to connect to our actual Mongoose database, let's go MongoDB database. Let's do mongoose.connect. And then it expects the URL string, your connection string. So I'm using MongoDB, so I'm just using the MongoDB Atlas clusters. And you can just sign up to this. There'll be a link in the description. It's completely free. Or there's a free tier for I think about 0.5 GB, which is enough for just learning. And if you just create a cluster, it's very simple. You create a cluster, you make sure you select the free tier, and it will take about 1 or 2 minutes for it to set up. So to connect, you want to click on connect. It will ask you to do some security stuff, which is setting up an account. I've already set one up. And once you've set up an account, you want to connect to your application. Then here you actually have the string. So I'm just going to copy the string and paste in the string here. So you have to put in your username and password. So I'm just going to say, I created a username called test user and password test user. You don't want to share these. I'm going to be deleting these after this video. So make sure these are private and that you do not share this information. And then your database, I'm just going to call it test_db. Then what we also have to do is add in some options. So at the end of this, add in another object. Actually, just for now, I'm not going to add in the options. And the final parameter it gives you is a callback. So this is once it's connected. I'm just going to say connected to MongoDB. So if we open up our terminal, you can see we get some deprecation warnings. So we have to add in some options to prevent these warnings from showing up. The first one is the URL parser, and the second one is the unified topology. So let's add those in. So use new URL parser, just set that to true, and use unified topology and set that to true as well. So now if we save this, you can see it connects and we don't get those warnings that we were getting up here. Okay, so to actually use Mongoose, what we have to do is we have to create models, which are based off schemas, and then those are used to actually interact with your MongoDB. So you have to remember that MongoDB is actually a NoSQL database. It's unstructured documents, and we're going to be using a schema, and the purpose of the schema isn't to set a strict restriction, set a strict document type, but it's just to help you and help Mongoose interact with the MongoDB database. I'm going to create a new directory called models, and then I'm going to create a file called user models.js. So let's import Mongoose again. So let's say Mongoose is equal to require Mongoose. And then let's do mongoose.schema. Let's say user schema is equal to a new Mongoose schema. So what we're doing here is we're just creating a new Mongoose schema, and this is going to define the structure of our document. Now, once again, just because we're setting the document structure here doesn't mean that this is strict. You can still change this and your document structure is completely flexible. So I'm going to put an object here, and I'm just going to add, this is going to be really simple. I'm just going to add a name as a string. So this expects JavaScript's built-in types. So there's just a string here. And I'm just going to say age as a number. Once again, JavaScript's built-in types. So we've said that the user, so this is a user schema, and we've just said it has a name, which is going to be a string. We haven't done any validation. And we've said age, which is just going to be a number. So then to actually create the model just associates the schema to a collection. We're just going to say user model is equal to mongoose.model. You give it a name, so this is the collection's name. So users is what I'm going to call it. You can call it whatever you want, obviously. And then we provide to it the schema. So user schema. Okay, so we've set up the schema and we've associated that schema to a model. Now let's just do a module.exports, and let's export the user model. So it's just going to be our default export from this file. Now what we can do is let's head back over here. let's grab that user model. So let's say user model is equal to require from models and user model. Let's grab that one and let's actually have it so that when we call this endpoint, we create a new user. So I'm just going to clear everything up. I'm going to wrap this in a try catch because we're going to be using async await. So let's just make this an async function. And what it's going to do, we're going to await user model dot create. So on this user model here that we've imported, there's a method called create where what we provide to it is actually going to be the document. So this expects a name and a age. So for now, I'm just going to hard code this. So John Doe, age, let's say 21. And then what this actually returns is a user, or at least it returns the document that was created, which includes things like the ID. And all I'm going to do is a response.json. So once again, because I'm not pitting status, it's going to default to 200 and just throw in the user object. And if there's an error, I just want to do response.status 500 and JSON. Let's do error is true, message, error.message. We will be going through a standardized way of handling our messages, but just for now, we're going to leave it like this. And let's just save that and test it out. So if I go to Postman, I create this, ignore this. It's not actually using this right now. We're using the hard-coded values. We get the ID, we see the name, the age, and there's v__v0. So now if we actually check our database, so if I close this out, I go to my collections, you can see we have that testDB, which is testDB because here we specified testDB. We have the users collection, and you can see we have that document that we just created. So we only have this one document. If I send this again and I refresh, you can see now we have two documents, both with John Doe, age 21. So now let's make this a bit more dynamic by taking the names from here. So let's do, so instead of this, I'm going to do request.name, request.body.name, and then request.body.age. I'm not going to be dealing with validation in this video. That could be a video in itself, and if you guys are interested in validation, I can make a video on that. But just for now, we're going to assume that it's always going to be correct, which you should obviously normally never do, but just for the sake of this video, we're just going to make sure that we always put in the correct values. So now if we test this out, let's create an object. Let's say name, new user, age 30. Let's send that. And you can see we have a new user, age 30. And if we check here, refresh this, you can see at the bottom here, we have that new user with that ID and age 30. Okay, so now let's create an endpoint to actually get a individual user. Let's do app.get, that's going to be get request. And the path, I want it to be the base path, but I want to get the ID from the URL. So when we use a semicolon and then ID, so this is just the name. So this is like a wildcard. So this could be anything. For example, we could do localhost port 5000, and this could be, so in our case, it can be an ID. So it's going to be some sort of random 24 character long string, and it will get this, and this will be our ID. And we can get access to that through the request object. So let's do that. Let's say, let's create the function. We get the request, the response, and next. So same as before. This is the general signature of an endpoint function handler. And to get this ID, it's request.params.id, or in our case, it's ID. If this was something like user ID, then this would be user ID. But I'm just gonna set this to ID so it's simpler. So let's wrap this in a try catch as well. And let's, to get a single user, we would use the user model, and there's a method called find by ID. And all it expects is the ID, and there's also some options that you can give it as well, but it's just only passes the ID for now. So we do request.params.id, and we do have to await this. So this is a async await function. and the result is actually the user that's returned. So let's do response.json result. And just for now, once again, I'm just going to copy and paste this and say there's a 500 error if this goes wrong. So let's test this out. Let's make a get request to let's first do a random URL doesn't exist. So you can see we get null. And normally you don't want to send back null. You want to probably send something like a 404 saying user not found. But let's also test it with a valid ID. So let's grab this one. So if we grab this, copy that and paste it into here, you can see we get back that user, so it's working correctly. So I said if this returns something like an empty user, we probably want to send back something like a 404. One way to do that is say if result. If there's no result, so we put an exclamation mark here. We might want to do something like return, or just, yeah, so return response.status 404, response.json, something like error true, message user not found. Although this can be quite repetitive and it's something that you don't really want to have to be constantly repeating this code throughout your app. You want to have it be easier. So now let's get into error handling. The way that I like to handle my errors is I would create a folder called utils. So this is just general utility functions that you have. And I'm going to create a file in here called utils.js. I'm going to create a class called HTTP error. And let's add in the constructor. And this is going to expect a status code and a error message. Now I'm going to do is say this dot status code is equal to status code, and this dot error message is equal to error message. Now the reason I'm creating this as a class is so that we can actually check if our error message is an instance of HTTP error. That might sound a bit confusing right now, but as we go through this, hopefully it'll be a bit clearer to you. So let's also export this. So if we do exports.http error and then set that equal to this class, it will export this, although this isn't a default export. So we do have to either destructure this. So let's grab that in our index.js. So let's say const utils is equal to require utils slash utils. Let's actually just destructure HTTP error directly from here. And the way that I like to handle my errors is I have a error handling middleware. So let's create a middleware here. And if you remember from before, I said that if we pass something to next, we can actually get access to it in our error handling middleware, which is going to always expect 4 arguments. So we do error, the request, the response, and next. So the way I like to do it is I do if error is an instance of HTTP error, then what I do is I return the response.status as the error.status code. So remember, error is HTTP error, where we have status code is the status code that is given. And then I just do JSON. I put an error here, set that to true, and the message is the error.error message. So this error.error message is this right here. So now if we ever throw into next an error of type HTTP error, so this, the class that we created, it's going to return this. And then I can put an else and just copy and paste this, except I'm going to set some defaults of 500 and server error. So you might be wondering why I'm doing it like this. It might seem a bit strange, but this is for the sake of consistency of your error messages, and also so that this can be actually scaled. So if you have multiple types of error messages, you can just do more if and else if statements and check the instance of that error and return it in a nice and consistent format. So now if we actually restructure this, so here instead of returning the response, I'm going to call next and pass in the error. So now you can see if this throws an error, it will go to next, and then next we'll put that error into error here, we'll check if it's an instance of HTTP error, which in this case, we're not actually throwing any HTTP errors, so it will never be. Then it will just go straight to this one right here, in which case it's a server error. And of course, that might not be true. This could be a validation error or something else. We'll go through that in just a moment. But for this one, what I want to do is actually use this error handling here. So instead of returning all of this, I'm just going to return next and say a new HTTP error. It's going to be a 404 and just say user not found. And you have to make sure to return this, otherwise it will also run this code and that would throw a error since we're writing to the response writer twice, which is not something you want to do. So now if we just test this out, so if we do something like this and we save it, you can see right now we're actually getting an error from Mongo. So this is a 500 error. It's actually a validation error because this is an invalid ID. So if I just make this a valid ID and just change this, then now you can see we get that error message that we set up. And to further just refactor this, so now instead of returning this, we just do next and error. Okay, so just to go through this one more time, since I know it can be a little bit confusing. We've created this class here, HTTP error, and the only purpose of this is just so we can check if it's an instance of HTTP error. We've created this middleware here at the bottom, which only runs if you actually pass something to next, in which case it will first check if that error is an instance of HTTP error, because if it is, then we know we can get the status code from it and we know we can get the error message from it. So like here, where we're passing it 404 and user not found, and then in the response, we are getting a 404 as a status and user not found. And then in something like this, where this would be a server error, or in our case, it's actually throwing a error if the URL form, the ID format is invalid, then it will throw a server error. Although obviously that one should actually never be thrown, since you should have validation to make sure that your ID is of the correct length. Okay, so now before we go any further into creating any more endpoints, I actually want to start to organize things a bit more. Since right now things are a bit hectic and we just have this one index.js file and everything's scoped to app. So let's create a new folder called controllers. And then within this controllers folder, I like to create a file, and that file is just index.js. And then I like to create another file, another folder, so another directory, and this will be my users controller. And then within users controller, you can have all of your endpoints. So I'm just going to call it user controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two endpoints from here, and I'm going to paste them into user controller. So I'm pasting them into this file right here. So now we need to get app, but I'm actually not going to use app. I'm going to use something else. So let's grab Express by requiring Express. And where before we were calling this directly, I'm actually going to call a method on this called router. So when we call router, what this does is that it gives us a new router object, which we can attach endpoints to, and all of the endpoints that we attach to it is specific to that instance of the router. So if I say router like this, let me just rename this to router. I can, instead of using app, I can use router.post. And similar with router.get, and router also has router.use. So the same as app, except now they're actually scoped to this specific router. Now the reason why you might want to use this is, let's say I wanted a middleware that is specific to only this router, so not any other endpoints that we have. Then what I could do is I could say router.use, and then this, any middleware that we put here will only be used for these endpoints. So then I've set up these two routes, and finally I'm going to export. I'm going to do module.export the router. So we've created the router, which initializes a new router object. We've attached to it these two endpoints. We'll add more in a bit, and we've just exported that new router that we've created. Then what I like to do is within my index.js, I grab the, I create a new router here as well, is equal to require express, and then I create a new instance of router again. And this is the purpose of this one is to actually connect every single endpoint that we have within our entire project. So what I do, then I also grab the controller. So it's a user controller is equal to require the user controller, which remember this is in itself a instance of router, which is unique to this one, which is separate from this one. Then what I can do is I can say router.use user controller. And then I can prepend a path to this. So I could say slash users this controller. So all of the endpoints that are slash users that start with slash users, we use this set of controller routes. And remember this one, we've said the base path and the base path with the ID. So these now change to being from this, so localhost 5000 slash to localhost 5000 slash users slash. So we've prepended this users to all of the endpoints within user controller. So this is how we can group our endpoints. And then this one here becomes users slash and then the ID wildcard. So here what you could do is you could set up all of your routes. So let's say we had another one like posts. Then we could do the posts controller. Of course, we don't have one, but this is how you do it. You could separate them out very easily. And you could have many of these. And then finally, we're just going to do a module.exports the router. So remember, we're attaching to this router, this new instance of router that we created, which is separate from this controller. We're connecting to this router the user controller, and we're prepending the slash users path to this. And then finally, once we've attached that to the router, we're exporting the router with this attached to it. Then what we can do is we can grab that. So we don't need this import anymore. We can do const routes is equal to require from controllers index. And actually we can just do slash controllers since index.js is automatically attached to the end of this. So what we can then do is we just say app.use the routes. So now you can see it's a lot cleaner. So then it's very clear what's going on. So these two middleware are completely global. This goes for every single endpoint. And the same is true with this one. And then if we go to our routes, you can see that we just have one set of grouped endpoints right now, which is our users. And then if we wanted to attach middleware specific to just this endpoint, we could do router.use and then the middleware here, whatever it is that you want, whether it's a third-party one or your own custom middleware. So I hope that makes it clear as to what we're doing here. And I think one thing that might be a little bit strange is this .router at the end. Just remember that when we say .router, we are creating a new instance of a router. So all of the routes that we're attaching to this are not actually connected to app until we connect it by saying use. Okay, so now let's just create a couple more endpoints. So we have our create, we have our get, and now let's just create another route here, the get, and this is going to get all of our users. So it's going to be an async, request, response, and next. And I'm going to wrap this in a try catch. And just say next on our errors. So once again, this will go to our error handling middleware at the end if this next gets called. If this next gets called. So let's do user model. Oh, and that's actually something we have to require. So let's get our user model. So now we have our user model. And then we can use the find. And find on its own like this, without any sort of filters, will actually just return all of our results. So all of our users. So if we say users is equal to await the find, then we just do response.json users. So now if we actually test this out, let's do slash. So you can see right now this will return nothing. So this is just because this route doesn't exist. We have to do slash users because we've prepended it here. If I make this request, you can see we get an array of all of the users that we have in our database. So this was working nicely. And just to show you guys that all of the other endpoints are still working as well. So if I do this one, we get an individual user. If I change this to a post and I say new user 2, age 32, this is still working. And you can see that they're all with the pre-appended users path. Finally, let's just do so we've got the create, get all, get individual, and let's do the update. So let's have this be a put request. We are once again going to expect an ID. Wrap this in a try catch. And then we're going to say, let's grab the user model. And the function we're going to be using is find one and update. So the first parameter it expects is the filters. So I'm going to say where the ID is equal to the request dot params dot ID. So once again, we're getting this ID from here, from the params. And then the second argument is actually the updated document object. So I'm just going to say name is request.body.name and age is request.body.age. And this will actually return to you the result, so the updated user, let's say. Well, actually, this will not by default return to you the updated user. It will return to you the user before. So I'll show you guys what I mean by that. So if I do response.json, the user, and let's just make sure to pass on any errors to our error handling middleware. Then if I come here and I grab this ID and I change this to a put request, I think we did. Yep, it was a put request. Now if I change this to updated and I change the age, if I send this, oh, we're actually getting a server error. Oh, and that was because we forgot to await this. So we do have to await this. Let me just change this to updated 2 now and 34. So now if we try this again, you can see it's not showing the old one. So it's still showing new user 2 and 33. But if I send this again, now it's showing the new one. So the reason for this is quite simple. We have to add in some options here saying new is true. So if we do that, and then I say 3 and 5 here, then it will return to us the newly updated document. And you can also see here we're getting a deprecation warning. And that's because we have to add in an option here, which is use, find, and modify. And just set that to true. So that will remove the deprecation warning. Oh, and I just realized this actually has to be set to false, not to true. So if we test this one more time, you can see now we're not getting that deprecation error warning. And now one more thing is, what if this is an invalid ID? So if I do something like this, you can see that it's just returning null. And no matter how many times I send it, it's just going to return null. So one thing you might want to do is insert it if it doesn't exist. So you can use upsert and set that to true. So if we save this now, so remember this ID here does not exist. If I send this, it creates it. And finally, for the last endpoint, I'm just going to do a router.delete, get the ID from the URL again, use the standard handler function signature, request, response, and next. Wrap this in a try catch. Remember to always pass down the error message. And then in our user model, so let's make this async await, so async, and let's await user model dot delete, and actually just use delete one. And we provide the filter, so I'm going to do underscore ID is request dot params dot ID. So this is getting the ID from here again, and the result from this is actually a little bit different. So if I actually show you guys what the result looks like, it doesn't return the document that was deleted. Instead, it returns a bunch of meta information. So if I just delete this one that we created, you can see that it returns a bunch of information here. One thing that might be useful for you is the deleted count. So you can see the deleted count is 1. So this ID was just deleted. If we send it again, it's 0 because the ID was already deleted. So you could do something like error false, deleted count, result.deleted count. So if you return something like that, it might be more useful. Of course, you can choose to handle this however you want. Okay, so just to go through these last 2 endpoints again, since I think I went through them quite fast. The put, so the update here is quite simple. We use on the user model, we're going to find one and update. We find it by the ID, so where the ID is equal to the request.params.id, which is from the URL, we're going to update the name and age to whatever was in the request body. And once again, we're not handling any validation. That I can go through that in a separate video if you guys are interested. We're saying new is true. So what this is doing is it's getting the newly updated document. So with these two values updated, otherwise it would return the old document. So I recommend setting new to true. We're saying use find and modify to false. This is just for deprecation reasons. And I've used upsert to true. This means if this ID does not exist, it will actually create it for you. And this is obviously optional. If it doesn't exist, you might want to not do anything. You might want to instead throw an error message. So it's up to you how you want to handle that. And then finally, I'm returning the user. For delete, it's also very similar. We're using the delete one. So this only deletes a single user. If we use delete, it will delete all of them that match this. In our case, I just want to use delete one. This returns a bunch of meta information, and it also I'm just returning the deleted count. Of course, you can return other information if you want. In all cases, we're using our error handling middleware to handle our error. And you can see here at no stage within this function do we return the response for the error. That is instead handled by this function here, where this is going to set the response for the error. And if we just look at this endpoint here, you can see if there's no result, we are throwing a new HTTP error. And actually, I think I forgot to import that. So let's import HTTP error from, we have to require that from utils. So if it doesn't exist, then it will throw this error message here. Okay, so just to wrap things up, I'm going to go over everything really quickly again. So first thing we've done is we've created a new instance of Express. We've also connected to our MongoDB database, where these two options are just to prevent deprecation errors. We've got the URL string, and of course this is secret. You might want to have this in something like an environment variable. And then this just also accepts a callback once it's connected. We've used the body parser package to parse the JSON and the body parser package to parse any URL encoded values. We've set this to false so that it uses the query strings package. And then we've set the app to use our routes. Within our routes, currently we only have one set of routes, so one set of endpoints, which we're importing from our user controller. So we initialize a new router, we attach to that router our user controller, and we append the /users endpoint, /users path to all of the endpoints within here. So now within our user controller, all of these paths are prepended with /users. And we're also exporting that router back here so that we can use it. We also have a global, this set of middleware is global. And we also have a global error handling middleware, which is going to check that error. It's going to see if it's of type HTTP error, and then it's going to return it. Otherwise, it's going to return a 500 with server error. Of course, I would recommend adding more. A good example would be for validation. The user model, you can actually have validation on here. So within your schema, you could set things like, if you have this as an object, you can say type string required true, and this will actually throw a validation error. And one of the things you could do is check if this is so we could do a else if, and check if error is an instance of mongoose.error.validation error. So this is actually the instance that these errors will throw. So you could check those, format it in a nice way, and return it. So that's just another reason why you want to use a error handling middleware. So you can check all of the instances and handle them the same. So you only do this once, and then throughout your app, wherever you throw the error, you know that it's going to be nicely formatted by your error handling middleware. If you guys are interested in more about error handling and validation, I can go through that in another video. And just to go through the user model one more time, we have a user schema, which defines the structure of it. And of course, you can do a lot more with this. I recommend going through the Mongoose documentation, seeing exactly what you can do. And we've attached this schema to a model, which is our collection. So if you look here, we have the users collection. and this is using the schema from this, and then we're exporting this as the default export, because on the user model we have a lot of nice helper functions like create, find one, update, delete, and a bunch more. So there's quite a few methods that are attached to our models. You can even add your own methods. So yeah, that's been it for this video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you guys are interested in more Express videos, then let me know. If you want me to create a video on validation, then also let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate a like, and consider subscribing to my channel to see more videos on Express or React. Thanks for watching. Bye.